Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, respect and reflection on the life of Winnie Mandela. We take a look at some of the tributes to the life of the late anti-apartheid activist. Also, tens of thousands of African migrants in Israel are left uncertain about their status as President Benjamin Netanyahu backpedals on a UN relocation deal. And the residents of the Libyan ghost town of Tawergha are also left in limbo as armed groups prevent their return years after they were forced out by troops. But first, acknowledgement for the important role that Winnie Mandela played in shaping South Africa's anti-apartheid movement have been pouring in from around the world. The 81-year-old activist, who was the former wife of the late Nelson Mandela, passed away on Monday. She was a charismatic and controversial figure who became one of the greatest icons of the struggle against white minority rule.
Supporters of opposition leader Julius Malema gathered outside the house of the late Winnie Mandela. Malema, who was expelled from the ruling ANC party in 2012, had become a confidant of Winnie Mandela in recent years. Both have been described as firebrand activists.
We have to accept that she was too old and she was sick, and she has left this responsibility in our hands. We'll continue the fight because we don't want to disappoint her.
In South Africa, a day after her death, her convictions for kidnapping and fraud were largely brushed aside by praise for her bravery and integrity during the struggle against apartheid.
She was an icon in our country's history, but especially as a woman. And these days, with all the issues we have around rights and inequality, I think, to be woman alone, a family, husband in jail, she was quite a person.
Across Africa, like here in Kenya, many people paid tribute to the anti-apartheid activists.
Winnie Mandela was a phenomenal woman. She was very influential in the fight for freedom in South Africa. She really helped Nelson Mandela.
She's a woman I'd love to emulate in her actions, her deeds, and her great contribution to the liberation of South Africa.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa said a state funeral will be held for Winnie Mandela on April the 14th.
Thousands of African migrants in Israel have been left in limbo after the government backtracked on a relocation agreement with the UN. A day after the arrangement was announced, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that the deal was in fact dead. It would have allowed thousands of migrants to stay in Israel, whilst others would have been resettled elsewhere in nations that reportedly included Germany, Italy and Canada.
Benjamin Netanyahu has changed his mind again, just hours after deciding to suspend a new UNHCR deal to resettle some 16,000 African migrants in Western countries. The Israeli Prime Minister has now stated he will cancel the pact altogether. After meeting with angry residents of South Tel Aviv on Tuesday, the PM reconsidered after hearing their concerns. It was Netanyahu's fourth statement on the issue in a matter of hours. On Sunday, he had announced scrapping an earlier controversial plan to deport some 37,000 migrants to Africa, namely to Rwanda and Uganda. On Monday afternoon at a press conference, Netanyahu said the plan, which had drawn criticism from human rights groups both at home and abroad, would have been replaced by the new one negotiated with the UN. Under it, Israel would have given temporary residency to half the migrants and sent the other half to Western nations. However, those Western nations quickly said that they were unaware of any such agreement. The plan to let so many migrants stay was also met with outrage by conservative politicians as well as anti-migrant groups in South Tel Aviv, where many of the migrants reside. In a tweet, the education minister and leader of the Nationalist Party, Naftali Bennett, said the plan was a call for millions of potential migrant workers to come to Israel. He also warned that the credibility of the Israeli government is at stake. Those concerns have now tipped the balance in favour of rejecting any deal with the UN, who have now urged Israel to reconsider their decision. The deportation legislation has been widely criticised at home and abroad, even by some of Israel's closest supporters.
Well, Kenyan opposition politician Miguna has been told he'll have to apply to regain his citizenship. The government claims that his current papers were obtained fraudulently and that he renounced his citizenship in 1988 when he took Canadian nationality. Miguna denies he ever lost his status. The lawyer was deported twice. The first time was in February when he was sent to Canada. The second time was last week when he says he was beaten and drugged and forced to Dubai. On Tuesday, top government officials, including the Interior Minister, appeared before a parliamentary committee to answer questions about the treatment of Miguna. Years after they were forced out of their homes in the civil war that toppled former leader Muammar Al Gathafi, tens of thousands of residents of the Libyan town of Tawergha are still waiting to go back. Locals, most of whom are black, were accused of supporting the late ruler. Now armed groups are blocking the roads into Tawergha, and for now it remains a ghost town.
The town of Tawergha was emptied in an act of collective punishment during the 2011 revolution. Forces from nearby Misrata accused black residents of the town of having supported Gaddafi. They had to flee and live for 7 years in squalid camps across the country. In 2017, a deal was reached so the residents could return to Tawergha. But as they were about to do so, this year groups from Misrata reportedly opened fire and stopped them from returning. They are once again stuck in the desert.
We'll remain here for now, and maybe we'll take a decision to travel onwards, but we won't use any weapons. We'll wave a white flag and an olive branch in the direction of Tawergha.
The return of the residents was supposed to have been a landmark reconciliation effort. The case symbolized divisions among ethnic groups in Libya.
People were used to a certain way of life, and suddenly we were moved to a different one. We were used to houses, air conditioning, television sets, and now we live in very tragic and difficult conditions.
The United Nations concluded Tawergha was deliberately destroyed in 2011 in order to make it uninhabitable. It said Misrata's militias had committed crimes against humanity.
Zimbabwe's new president is taking steps to reassure investors that his administration's approach to property rights is very different to that of his predecessor, Robert Mugabe. As part of that, Emmerson Mnangagwa's started tackling some of the fallout from agrarian reform, which displaced white commercial farmers from their land without compensation. Although a complete reversal of the policy isn't on the table, Mnangagwa's promising some farmers long-term contracts. Our team reports.
John was born in Zimbabwe. His family settled here more than a century ago. Following the land reform of 2000, he lost his farm. But he still works on this land as he decided to rent it from the new owner. Today, the government plans to offer 99-year leases, which will help to secure these farmers.
For a very long time, our tenure on the land has been very insecure. So to me, anything that will bring a bit more security is very positive.
John is not the only farmer interested. 99-year contracts are far from being formalized, but the Commercial Farmers Union has had many inquiries.
Most people who've left still have some ties here, and they come back and they call in through the office and say, so what's the prospect? We are seeing quite a lot of younger generation farmers who've seen opportunity particularly in things like the very high maize price locally to get cracking and go farming, because it's not very often in the world where you can find a maize price that's pretty much double the international price, and if you can give it a crack, you can make good money.
Present Zimbabwean authorities are working hard to restore confidence. The agricultural minister has even promised to compensate white farmers who were dispossessed during Mugabe's land reform. This was confirmed when the tobacco auctioning season started in Harare.
It's not a question of whether or not government would like to compensate. That's established. His Excellency, the President of the Republic, pronounced it, and it's going to be done. It's the question of the availability of resources.
Food security is a priority in Zimbabwe today. For John, the country has taken a good turn.
There's a road that we've all got to walk down, and I think we are starting on that journey, and I am very hopeful. If I wasn't hopeful, I would have given up and gone a long time ago. Somewhere else, I don't know where, but I would have found somewhere else to go.
The very few white farmers who still work in Zimbabwe have no intention to leave.
Well, one of Sierra Leone's best-known musicians, Ahmed Jankan-Nabe, has died aged 54. He was dubbed the Boo Boo King after remixing the traditional sounds of the Temne people, called Boo Boo, and creating modern electronic dance tracks. He rose to popularity at home before he headed to the States at the end of Sierra Leone's civil war in 2002. We'll leave you with some of his Boo Boo sounds. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Somebody, somebody, I need somebody to see.
Revisited, presented by Stuart Norval. What has become of Sudan after 20 years of American economic sanctions? How does it intend to boost development now that the embargo has been lifted? The people of Sudan are fighting for their future, but against a backdrop of armed conflict, repression and poverty. Revisited on France 24 and France24.com.